No, I'm right in front of Caroline. So yeah, we're in Cologne. We're all in the same. Most of us are in the same office.
Okay. Okay, I see that we're live now.
We are going live.
But you need to be co-host though.
No, I don't have to. Just everybody has just a blank screen.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, we're gonna start letting people in. It's 5 o'clock. Okay, Gabe. My camera's still. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're just going to get started at the moment. Okay, so I want to thank everybody for being here. And I just like to say that this webinar is being live streamed. So if you'd like to be unidentifiable, maybe just change your name, although all cameras remain closed. Okay, if we can just get right into it. So my name is Rondeka Mgwaba and I work at Democracy International. I work mainly on the international democracy community, which is a project that aims to create a platform for networking and learning opportunities for people that work on direct democracy and civic participation. It's also a platform where people that are interested in the topic can gain knowledge and sort of join the conversation. So this webinar series, it came about because when I arrived at Democracy International, I was completely not really sure what direct democracy is. And I'd say right now I'm still learning as well. But whenever I speak to people in my life, it's always a very hard conversation about understanding what exactly direct democracy is. So I thought making a direct democracy simplified webinar series would be a great opportunity for our community and for us as Democracy International to inform people on direct democracy and the instruments that are available to them or the lack thereof maybe. So in this webinar, we will examine the feasibility and the implications of employing direct democracy on a transnational scale. We will delve into principles, potential benefits, and limitations of direct democracy and citizen participation in the context of cross-border decision-making. And now I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the structure that I sort of came up with for the webinar. So really it is about having it as simple as possible for anybody to understand what it is. So I thought let's start with basic theoretical descriptions of what transnationality is and answering the question of whether or not direct democracy instruments can be used on a transnational level. This will be done by Caroline Vernijn. And then our second panelist will be Daniela Van Schiesch, and she'll be speaking about an example that currently exists on the European level. This is a European Citizens Initiative, and she'll also introduce what is a proposal currently right now that has potential to take place on the global level. And then we'll have our third speaker go into transnationality in action. So John Stever will take us through a Global Citizens Assembly, which is a campaign that's already taken place, and it was around climate change. And he's going to give us a more in-depth description of how it worked, what didn't. And then at the end of all of this, we'll follow with a Q&A session where we get to open up the floor for questions, which will mainly be in the chat. So feel free to put your questions in the chat. Our team will be monitoring them as we go. And so as an introduction, I thought it was important to get some groundwork with the basics of the theory of transnationality, what institutions exist on this level, and most importantly, what democratic instruments exist on the level. To take us through this, Caroline Vernijn, our global program manager here at Democracy International. She mainly works on building alliances, raising awareness, and managing campaigns aimed at creating democratic infrastructure for citizens to take part in decision-making on a global level, as well as organizing key events such as our Global Forum on Modern Direct Democracy, which is currently the biggest forum on direct democracy. So Caroline, please can I hand over to you? I think you are able to share your screen and we will hear from Caroline.
Thank you so much, Landeka. I hope you're all hearing me well, and I'm going to try and share my screen indeed. So I hope everyone can see that. I can't see it, wait. Okay, yes. Yeah, so we have a direct democracy simplified webinar today under the title of transnationality, and it is sort of a monstrous term that I now have the terrible job of trying to simplify. What is transnationality? So I'm going to do my best, and of course afterwards there will also be time for questions. Transnationality is a super broad concept, so I definitely won't be able to cover everything. But the idea of this webinar is to go through the basics, right? So yeah, when we talk about transnational what? We talk about anything that is extended beyond national boundaries. So since, let's say, there is some discussion about this, but just for the little history lesson, like since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, that brought peace to Europe. So Europe had been at war for decades, right? Different kingdoms and principalities just fighting each other. And in the Treaty of Westphalia, it defined sort of borders for the first time, like this is your space and this is my space. And I will recognize that you're a sovereign in your country and I'm a sovereign in my country. And that is basically the invention of the modern nation state. So that is something that is relatively new, but so 400 years old. And in those 400 years, the nation state or countries have really become the basis of like how we do politics, right? So it is the main arena for where we make decisions on what is going to happen to our lives, right? So in a lot of countries, less and less these days, unfortunately, but in most countries, you can vote for a parliament where you will be represented and where people will make laws in your name that then sort of govern your life. But there are, of course, issues, or there are times where it's not enough to make decisions in the framework of these nation states. And in that case, we need transnationality. So then we are talking about transnationality. So yeah, when we talk about transnationality, and there are many, many different kinds about that, but we usually talk about a setting in which we make shared policies that address the interests of multiple states or multiple political entities. So that means that we make decisions together, that decisions are made sort of in a collaborative way. Something else that's interesting to note, policies is not the same as politics. It's not a party running for office, trying to get your vote. It is deciding on a course of action to address a specific issue together. Interests is another key word in this phrase, right? Like who is benefited by this, and why does it need to take place not on a national level, but on a different level altogether. And yes, so it says there are multiple states, but actually it doesn't have to be states. It could also be cities or other political actors. The key part here is that it passes across national borders. Yeah, and so why do we do that? Why do we have something that like transnationality? Why have we set up all of these very complicated structures? It's because we've realized that we have common problems, right, that cross borders. Like we have climate change. We've all spent 2 years working from home or studying from home or not meeting our families because of a pandemic that obviously doesn't care about borders. Conflicts are often between nation states and therefore, are above the nation state level. Economic crises like the 2008 financial crisis, like had effects all over the world. So states at some point recognize that there are simply problems that are too big for them and that they need to tackle on a different level. Some transnational organizations or multilateral organizations are just there to foster cooperation between nation states. So it's just to work together better, to coordinate policies, to make sure that, because countries realize that they are too small to do something by themselves. I come from Belgium. We are a tiny country where we are very, very aware of the fact that there's not much we can do together. So we try to make alliances with different countries, and we have that in different settings to be more effective, right, on the global stage. And to prevent wars between nation states. And then finally, sort of a third cluster of a reason of being for these transnational organizations is to ensure justice and human rights. So we have decided 75 years ago this year that human rights are universal values and that every single human being on this planet has them. They're inalienable, and we need institutions to protect those human rights. We need institutions where people can turn to in case their human rights are being violated. Right, so that brings us to, that all sounds great, right? We should have more of that. So what do we already have actually? So we have very simple ones. We have many different transnational organizations, and I'm not going to present all of them, but I want to present some of them just to give you an idea of like what different kinds are out there. So for example, there are very simple ones like the Mekong River Commission is a commission of cities along the Mekong River in Cambodia, Vietnam, and Thailand. And they are just there to make sure that the water quality is good, that there is no conflict around the availability of water, and to sort of coordinate action on that. That's a very simple one. Then you have, a little more complicated ones, such as the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization was established to foster economic cooperation and financial cooperation between countries, because we decided that free trade is something that we want between countries, and that makes that helps people. So therefore, we set up a World Trade Organization, and of course we can debate whether or not the WTO actually does that. But we set up the World Trade Organization to coordinate policies around taxes between different countries, for example. That is also a relatively easy one. Okay, let's try and do a more difficult one. You have regional transnational organizations. So not every transnational organization is completely global or completely local. You have, for example, the African Union, but you also have the Organization of American States. It does a little more already, because it also guarantees like human rights for people in its member states. It has human rights courts. It coordinates policies. It mediates between members, and for example, it monitors elections, so it makes sure that democracy is guaranteed in the Americas. Okay, then let's try a little more complicated still. So the European Union was founded. So I said, but I lied to you actually, that the Treaty of Westphalia brought peace to Europe. It worked for a little while, but not for very long. Like Europe as a continent has, of course, been war-ridden for a very long time, and especially the two world wars absolutely devastated it. And what we noticed in Europe is that what often happened is that, one or two of our member states, which shall not be named, like to fight each other, and then drag the rest of the world along with them. So the European Union was founded to coordinate policies, economic policies. So it was very simple. It was about coal and steel in the beginning, because the reasoning was, if our coal and steel trade, so the basis of our weapons manufacturing industry, if that is linked to each other, then countries can't go to war to each other. I won't sell you steel if you're going to fight me with it, right? So that was the initial idea of the European Union. It started as the Union of Coal and Steel. But then over the years, the European Union grew and sort of gave itself, or the members of the European Union saw the value of adding more functions to it, right? So now the European Union also has climate change policy. There's a European Central Bank that governs the euro. There's a monetary union, right? So there are a lot of, not all member states, but a lot of member states of the EU have a common currency, the euro. There's a European Court of Human Rights where I can go and file a complaint if my human rights have been violated in my member state. So the European Union is a transnational organization that has grown over time. Okay, I'm bringing you to the last one, the UN. So I think everybody has heard about the UN, the United Nations. It is, I would say, the closest thing we have to a world government, with the small or the big difference that, of course, there is no government at the UN. The UN, we don't have ministers, or we don't have a president of the UN. We have a secretary general, and then we have the General Assembly, which is which you could regard as a parliament, a world parliament, except that, of course, the people at the General Assembly are not elected by us directly, right? You don't get to vote for them. You vote for your national government appoints a parliament. Well, you vote for your national parliament, that appoints a government, that appoints a Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs will appoint somebody to sit in the General Assembly. So you only very indirectly have a say in the UN. Yeah, but so what does the UN do? Oh, well, lots of stuff. Right, so the UN, it does everything, right? So yeah, in the pandemic, the World Health Organization was instrumental in sort of coordinating policies across countries. There's the UN Development Program, which tries to help economic development and human development across the planet and sort of lift people out of poverty. There's the International Criminal Court in The Hague, which you've certainly heard of, where yes, abuses of human rights can be prosecuted and are tried. There's the International Labour Organization, which regulates labor standards across the world. There's UNESCO, which deals with culture. And then there's even things that you might never have thought of, but like WIPO, which deals with intellectual property standards across borders, or you have the International Aviation Authority, which makes sure that planes can fly from one country to the next under standardized regulations, right? Because if the rules would be different in Sweden than they are to Egypt, then that would actually be dangerous. So all of these agencies and all of these subsections of the UN have their own sort of dedicated function. Right, and so why do we have these? Because we decided that we needed them, because some problems cannot be dealt with on the local level. And so that brings us to sort of my two closing words that I want to say here. Two elements are super important when we think about transnational decision making, and like let that word fade away. Like transnational decision making basically just means like anything that we do that crosses beyond, you're voting for your national parliament. And so one important element, and I think that's also what we hear a lot when it comes to the European Union, for example, is the element of subsidiarity. It's another awful word, which means that the power of the government ought to reside at the lowest feasible level, or in human terms, we make decisions at the level where it fits. So, for example, if we're going to talk about the road in front of my office, it does not make sense to do that on the national level, and it definitely does not make sense to have the UN rule about it. That's something that the city council does, right, here in Cologne. If we talk about climate change, then it might make sense that we do it at the international level. But of course, if we talk about climate change, it could also mean that we are talking about planting more trees in the city. And so you see how it is a waterfall of where decisions are made. And it is a very important guiding principle that the lowest possible level where decision can be made is where decision should be made, because it's the closest to the citizen. So, and that brings us to my final term for today is representation, right? Because all of these bodies on the transnational level, or most of them, with one exception, reside on the principle of representation. So that you are represented by somebody who makes decisions for you. So in the best case, and that is really in the best case, because only a minority of countries on the world today are democracies where you can vote. In the best case, I vote for a parliament, and that parliament assembles a government, and that government appoints somebody who will represent me in one of these transnational institutions. And that person should speak for me, right? And so our question today deals with, like, how can we go beyond that? We live in an age of technological possibilities that were unimaginable 20 years ago. So how does that influence this? We have countries where people don't have the possibility to be represented on the national level, so let alone on the international level. How do we deal with that? And maybe mainly the question, like, are some policies too abstract, too far from the citizens to be dealt with by citizens themselves? And so I would already argue that that is not the case. And then I will hand it over to Daniela, who has some actual examples of transnational democracy in action around the world already today. And so thank you very much.
Thank you, Caroline. But before we move on, after telling us about all these transnational institutions that exist, what would you say are the current state of transnational institutions in relation to accountability and democracy is like as it stands at the moment?
Yeah, so as I said, like only in all of these institutions, with maybe the exception of the European Union, where people vote directly for representatives in the parliament, right? So you have European level elections. But all of the other ones are basically based on member state representation. So what is represented there is the agglomerated interest of all citizens in a member state, and mostly the majority, right? So because in a functioning democracy, I would vote for a parliament. In the parliament, parties would have to build a coalition. They would have to get 50% of the seats, and then they would make the rules for that country for the next 4 or 5 or 6 years usually. And I might happen to belong to the 40% of citizens that don't agree with this policy, but I'm not shown anywhere in the system, right? Nobody is taking my interests to the global level. And so this is, I think, a major flaw that we have right now. It's a huge filter. And we've seen it work. For example, I think the most clear example is climate change, where there are, there is a big coalition of citizens around the world who believe that there should be action on climate change, but there are very few governments who are taking that action or who are willing to push that action forward on the global level. So that, I think, that is the most flagrant existence of. Not that there are no exceptions, there definitely are.
Okay, thank you, Caroline. And now that we have a solid understanding of what transnationality is and how democratic all these institutions that we just heard about are, I would like to get into an example of this. So on the European level, we have something that's called the European Citizens Initiative. And the European Citizens Initiative, which is usually called the ECI, is a European Union mechanism aimed at increasing direct democracy and enabling EU citizens to participate directly in the development of EU policies, introduced with the Treaty of Lisbon in 2007. So Daniela is going to speak to us about that. And just like a fun fact about Democracy International, so our founding fathers actually were part of the lobbying towards the ECI back when it was just an idea. And Democracy International was formed, and now we work as a partner of the ECI, mainly with lobbying, and we're also part of the ECI Forum. So she'll be telling us a bit about the European Citizens Initiatives, and just like specifications about that and how that works and what that kind of looks like on a real level. And then she'll also go on to tell us about something that's called the World Citizens Initiative, which forms part of a campaign called the We the People's Campaign, which is still at proposal level right now. But this idea is sort of to democratize the UN. So Daniela is our European manager at Democracy International, and she's our ECI expert. So we're going to hear everything ECI related from her. Thank you, Daniela.
Thanks a lot, Lenika. I'm really happy to join this session on transnationality because I get another chance to talk about my favorite democratic tool, and that's the European Citizens Initiative. So I'm going to share my screen right now. Just give me a quick heads up that you can see that. Okay, good. Yeah, so this is the Direct Democracy 101, but we're going to look into a little bit of specifications of how the real life transnational direct democracy tools can work. And we have one concrete example for that, and that's the European Citizens Initiative. It's till now the world's only and first transnational tool of, well, I say near direct democracy because it's not necessarily binding. It's an agenda setting instrument, but we're going to get into that in just a second. But as far as speaking about near direct democracy and at least giving citizens the opportunity to put a proposal on the table and really get into dialogue with decision makers, the ECI is the example that we have at transnational level. And it could be already an inspiration for the global level with our campaign for the World Citizens Initiative. So a little bit of background about what the ECI is in case you don't know. There's some civil society background in the ECI, so that's definitely the history of Democracy International. It's really rooted in the ECI. So about 20 years ago, when the ECI was just an idea, it was really the founding members of Democracy International that was at the Convention on the Future of Europe in 2002 that was lobbying for an idea like the ECI to make it into the Lisbon Treaty. And it was very inspired by the direct democracy tools of Switzerland, really citizens initiative and bottom-up instruments. And you can see some of the photos here. These are from the time when they were collecting signatures at the convention and really lobbying for the ECI to make its way in. Democracy International was not an established organization at the time, but it was the founding members of Democracy International, along with 110 other NGOs there, and a number of MEPs that was supporting this proposal. It made it in, so that's a spoiler alert. We do have the ECI today, and that's in Article 11, Article 24, and then the regulation is something that has seen an update already. In 2020, we see now the new, we call the rules of the game of the ECI, and that's how ECIs are run, the real specifications of how to run an ECI. And I'm going to go over that right now. Because I think that is really going to be the basis for us. If we're thinking about we want to have a tool like this at global level for the UN, we need to look at the ECI because it's the only comparable instrument that we could have that is going to allow us to understand how we can get something like this from the European level to scale it up to the global level. So ECIs 1, 2, 3, really it should be 6 because there's about 6 official steps that you need to launch an ECI. So first things first, you're going to need 7 citizens. So you and 6 other EU citizen friends from 7 different EU member states that can launch an ECI. And this can be on anything that the EU has competencies to act on that doesn't change the EU treaties. And of course, that is not against EU values, that's following human rights, and so on. And so if you can pass that first verification stage, then you go on to the next one, and that's already the signature collection stage. In the ECI, we need 1 million signatures within 1 year to be able to be considered a successful initiative. And there's a threshold in 7 member states. So not all 1 million signatures can come from Germany. This has to be a really European transnational tool. So there's a threshold in 7 member states for that. There's a possibility to collect signatures online as well as offline, making this tool also a direct digital tool. And for that, we have the central online collection system that the European Commission provides free of charge with 24-hour help desk. It's worked very well. And we also have the ECI Forum, where Democracy International is also supporting the content of the forum, offering advice to organizers. And it's really a help desk for ECI organizers. If you're thinking about launching an ECI, if you want to get background information or learning materials or guidance materials on ECIs, learn the success stories, how to make it to 1 million signatures, that's the place that you're going to want to be. And then what happens if you make it to 1 million signatures? Well, then there's going to be a signature verification stage, and that happens at the member state level, because their member states are, of course, the ones who are going to have the data of those signatories. They have 3 months to do that. And then once that's finalized and the 7 member states, at least minimum 7 member states have issued that the signatures are indeed verified, usually that's done by a random sample, then the political response can begin for that ECI. What happens first is organizers are going to be invited within 1 month to the commission to have an exchange. The organizers can then present their case to the commission, why they think that this particular initiative should be taken up by the commission. The European Parliament, in the meantime, within 3 months, is also going to have a public hearing with the possibility of having a public resolution, also, and a vote on the ECI. And then within 6 months of submitting the signatures, the commission is going to issue its response. Now, like I said, this is a tool of near direct democracy, so it's not binding. The commission does not have to take up the initiative, but it is an invitation to the commission, is the words we always say, and it is the ECIs basically can serve as an inspiration for future legislation, and that's exactly has been the case for several initiatives. Now you can see on the right hand side here the 7 answers ECIs already. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I can say a little bit about each of them and their level of responsiveness from the commission. End of the cage age has been responded to nearly 1-to-1, so really almost 100% of the organizers' demands have been taken up by the commission. And then right to water, for example, the very first successful initiative, there's a new EU water directive. And if you're interested in this, you should be following then in July, we'll have 2 ECIs that are also going to see responses. So that's going to be Stop Finning on shark trade and Safe Cruelty-Free Cosmetics. And actually Safe Cruelty-Free Cosmetics tomorrow is going to be the public hearing in the European Parliament. So you can also watch that if you're going to be interested. So these ECIs are following this exact timeline here. Okay, now some specific special benefits that the ECI has provided. I would say it has a huge benefit in digital and youth engagement. So it has a very special digital dimension because, first of all, signatures can be collected online. That's not always the case with national petitioning tools that we have, or even local petitioning tools. Typically, this has also been collected on paper. With the COVID times, this is now changing a bit more in the digital direction, which is good. And then, of course, there's also the possibility to sign with the electronic ID. Right now, in 16 member states, they really want to push that. The European Parliament, especially, is pushing that across all member states. That would be great because then, just with a Face ID or with a fingerprint option in your on your smartphone, you can sign an ECI within seconds. You don't have to fill out the form that requires all the data. So that's something that we really hope to see in the future. There's also a special youth engagement proponent of the ECI, and now you can see here, Belgium, Germany, Estonia, Malta, Austria, and Greece, you can sign below 18. So all those are 16. Greece, you can sign at age 17. So it's a good way to get young people to sign ECIs. We can't get data on how many young people sign ECIs because it's all encrypted information. But we have information about the organizers, the age distribution of all ECIs. And you can see here that there is quite interest from young people, at least from age 21 to 30. That's considered definitely young. And there's definitely an interest for them to organize ECIs. So we can assume, I think, that also there's an interest in young people to sign ECIs, which makes sense. People are connecting closely to issues these days much more than political parties, for example. So there's a really interesting use the engagement proponent to ECIs there. This is just, I think, interesting to take a look at which countries really produce successful ECIs. So I would say if you're looking at launching an ECI, think about having Italy and Spain as your target country, because they have a pretty good track record with successful ECIs. Okay, now a couple of the shortcomings. First of all is the low public awareness. This was we helped fund this, we commissioned YouGov to do a survey in 4 member states on the level of awareness of ECIs. We did this a couple of years ago. And what we found out is that only 2.4% of people on average, EU citizens, know what the ECI is. Now, there are some Eurobarometer surveys out there that have higher percentage, but this was an independently commissioned study. So in any case, it's low. It is low. Even the EU Barometer responses are low. And there is attempts to combat this. There is public awareness campaigns that the European Commission is pushing for. And there's different initiatives like ECI Day, which is going to be now in 2 weeks, that Democracy International is also a permanent partner of. So there are initiatives to work on this, but in the end, it all comes down to we also have a lack of a very weak European public sphere as well. So ECI is just another tick there. Another shortcoming that we often criticize is also that the ECIs could use stronger political impact and definitely more political visibility. But again, this lies in the instrument itself, because it is an agenda setting tool. It is not a direct democracy tool. It is a near direct democracy tool. We have ideas how to get that stronger. We want this to become a direct democracy tool and a right of every EU citizen, also lead then to trigger EU-wide referendum. But now we're still a couple steps behind there. Okay, now putting this into the global perspective. So we really want to look at the ECI as our main comparison for having a World Citizens Initiative. What we always say, why it's even important to have something like a World Citizens Initiative is, first of all, the UN today is facing a lot of the same criticisms that the EU back in the early 2000s at the last convention has faced. The democratic deficit, there's no real opportunity for ordinary citizens to take part and to have a voice, and decisions are really made top down. This is the same kind of arguments that the EU was facing 20 years ago. And since then, we've seen a lot of steps definitely in the right direction. So what we always say, we say global problems require global solutions. For that, we also want citizens to take part in that, and global citizens and people to have a say on that. And so what the World Citizens Initiative would do is basically give a voice to ordinary citizens in global politics, and that you don't need to be somebody like Greta Thunberg, I would say, that can take then the democratic global stage, but that also ordinary citizens could basically take part in helping shape the global agenda. And of course, this is directed towards the UN, because also, as Caroline mentioned, is our only real monitoring and body that we have at global level. The We the People's campaign, as briefly mentioned by Lundeka, is the campaign that we have with Democracy International, with Civicus, and Democracy Without Borders, pushing for a World Citizens Initiative. That's some of the organizations that are on board, plus 200 other civil society organizations. And we have now also, in the meantime, commissioned a report on how exactly World Citizens Initiative could look like. So I'm going to do a quick little comparison of how the World Citizens Initiative could look like in real life based on the ECI. So we commissioned this report with a couple of years ago with an expert on the ECI, James Organ, and Ben Murphy is an expert on the UN. They came together and they basically looked at how a World Citizens Initiative could look like modeled on the ECI. So The good news is you don't need to read the entire study. It's definitely possible it's definitely feasible to have a World Citizens Initiative. And there's also articles in the UN treaty that would allow for this. And basically how it would look like is, first of all, to launch, as I mentioned, 7 EU members, 7 EU citizens from 7 EU member states. What our experts in study suggest is 10 citizens, and that's across this geographical representation. And this comes directly from the Security Council representation as well. So we also decided to follow that. Who oversees? It's clear for the ECI, it's the European Commission who has the lead there. For the World Citizens Initiative, our study recommended that a new organ of the UN would be established, and that could be something called like the World Citizens Initiative Administrative Board. So some new creation in the UN would also be then necessary to make sure all of the administrative and day-to-day things would also run for the World Citizens Initiative. Now the big question, of course, is how much support would be needed? Because as we know, ECI, 1 million signatures in 1 year, 7 EU member states. We've come to the conclusion in the study that 5 million signatures would be a fair ask across 18 months. And again, with that geographical representability, as we saw in establishing the Citizens Committee. And the threshold here would be 0.5% of the population in each of those states. And then to verify the signatures, as we said with the ECI, EU member states do this typically on a random sample. For the World Citizens Initiative, there's 2 opportunities here and two possibilities. One is that each country carries out its own verification. Now, this already, you can see where there could be some trouble. I mean, non-democratic states. There's a question then of credibility and if they can really be trusted there. And then the second option is there would be a centralization of the verification support in a UN body. So there are a couple of options. And then coming down to World Citizens Initiative response, what happens if this 18 months we have 5 million signatures reached within 18 months across those states. Of course, it's clear in the ECI, it's the European Commission who responds with the European Parliament responses, the public hearings and so on. With the World Citizens Initiative, there's a couple possibilities there that we could have. First, it could be a response by the UN Security Council that would have a motion for resolution. This would be especially be in cases that have everything to do with peace and security, as that's the body that deals with that. A second option would be then to trigger a special session of the UN General Assembly, and here heads of state also take part. So it's all about, again, bringing something to the table of the decision makers and coming closer into dialogue with them. And then a third option is also that it's discussed in one of or multiple of the 6 main committees of the UN. So there are a couple different options there. And again, this is not meant to be a completely binding instrument. That also cannot be the case at the UN level. We're also not saying that it's going to answer all of our questions in democratizing the UN and making transnational democracy a reality. But the ECI also doesn't solve all of the EU's democratic problems. It does bring us one step closer to democratizing the EU, and that's exactly what we want to see with the UN. So this is just a reminder that it was civil society who was pushing for the European Citizens Initiative back then, and there's civil society support behind the World Citizens Initiative. So I think we're already at a good first few steps here.
Yeah, thank you, Daniela. I think a lot of people would argue or worry that this is a lot of signatures that need to be collected, and there's obviously a lot of work that needs to be done for these ideas to actually be brought forward. And I'm just wondering, what do you think the role of civil society organizations and grassroots movements can be here? Because it's definitely not something that's member state related necessarily, but more, I think, civil society organizations. And what role do you think they can play here? Maybe just in 2 minutes.
Yeah, I can see, I think because we connect so closely to issues, and I think when we think global problems, we think the first thing that comes to my mind is Carolina already mentioned, is also climate issues. So I think especially a binding together, coming together of the major climate organizations and pushing for an instrument like this, what could be a first step, and having like Greenpeace and so on. These are already some of the organizations that are endorsing the Campaign for a World Citizens Initiative. And it's really just about having that platform. So it was also a variety of democracy organizations back 20 years ago that was pushing for the establishment of an ECI. And I think if we connect World Citizens Initiative closer to a topic that needs urgent response, like the climate crisis, I think could be a good first step to really pushing for and building a campaign for a World Citizens Initiative.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Daniela. Moving on, we're going to speak to John Steven now, and he's going to be taking us through transnationality in action. So what's actually happened now at the global level? Where are we sitting? So in 2021, the Core Assembly brought together about 100 people around the world, and this is a snapshot of the world's population. And this was a deliberative democracy exercise. The participants and the citizens of the assemblies learned about and discussed climate and ecological crises and presented proposals at COP26. This is a climate conference in November 2021. John is a co-founder and managing director of Innovation of Policy Foundation and co-founder of Impact Hub Kigali, among other initiatives. John co-initiated and coordinated the 2021 Global Assembly on Global Climate. We're going to hear from John now about that initiative, and he's going to tell us a bit more.
Thank you, Landeka, and hi, everyone. It's great to be with you to share a little bit about this question. So first of all, I just wanted to build a little bit on the introduction from Caroline about what is transnationality, and to recognize that, of course, the modern nation state as an idiosyncratic concept does trace its origins to Europe. The kind of modern global order, if you argue, could trace its origins to, for example, Westphalia, or largely to sort of European initiation. But I also want to recognize that in the pre-colonial period, Uganda, for example, had more than 70, you could argue, nations, individual sort of linguistic communities that were self-organized before colonization. In neighboring Rwanda, where I've lived for the last 15 and a half years, the colonial boundaries are actually smaller than the pre-colonial nation state of Rwanda-Urundi. And so I want to kind of recognize that this idea of like of a nation or a group of people arguably could, as a sort of social technology, could trace its roots back about 11,000 years ago to the Neolithic Revolution. Around the time when humanity started being able to produce agriculture, they started being able to our collective ancestors started being able to actually co-locate in larger numbers. And in the process of co-locating in larger numbers, they had to create sort of forms of social technologies that would enable people to live together in groups larger than sort of hunter-gatherer communities. We created religions, we created music, we created customs, weddings, all of the things that kind of have evolved into the modern nation state around flags and national anthems and sports like football that knit us together at a national level, at a community level, but also, of course, often at a global level every 4 years. And so just wanted to kind of share this idea of the sort of social technology that's evolved, and recognizing that this idea of sort of independent communities that coexist side by side is something that traces its roots back, of course, 11,000 years. But it's also important to recognize that it's really difficult to sort of address these issues that don't have borders, which Caroline really very well articulated. That things like climate change, like pandemics, et cetera, don't care where you are around the world, and we have sort of a collective action crisis when we sort of come together as independent, sort of self-interested nation states or communities of people. And so it's for that reason that with the community of the Global Assembly, we started reimagining what could sort of planetary governance look like if we think about how humans could come together at an individual level to be able to articulate a common position on a subject. And so I'm just going to share my screen and offer a little presentation for you. Let's see if I can Are you able to see that?
Yes.
Right. Perfect. All right. Transnational what? In action. So I'm going to talk about the Global Citizens Assembly on climate. And before I do that, again, I'll just zoom out a little bit and talk a little bit about the emergence of citizens' assemblies in general within the context of what's been referred to as the deliberative wave. And so in the blue, you see sort of democratic innovations. And just to say that this is a database from the OECD, so it focuses on kind of OECD countries. So it's not a globally representative, but it's kind of indicative data set to show kind of how citizens' assemblies have emerged. And then within this area of democratic innovation, sort of transnational democratic innovations or innovations that sort of democratic forums that take place between two nation states is very, very new emerging phenomenon. So the OECD database traces the first transnational democratic innovation to around 2007. And so then what is a transnational citizens assembly? So we could argue that like a normal citizens assembly is a body of citizens who come together, deliberate. It's often considered to be the most kind of robust or elaborate model of representative deliberative democracy. Some characteristics: generally, citizens' assemblies bring together the membership through a process called sortition or lottery selection. It means that the participants, there's an intention for those participants to represent the wider population. And you often do this through a two-step sort of random selection process where you bring together a randomized pool of the population. In Europe, you might be able to use sort of national voter registry or social security type identifications to be able to pull together a random pool of citizens. And then what you'll do is you'll apply a second random selection with algorithms to ensure that the final selection matches certain demographic characteristics of the underlying population. I'll talk a little bit more about that when I go into what we did with the Global Assembly. So a couple of common phases. Generally, citizens' assemblies have a learning phase where the members of the assembly will learn about a particular issue. They'll be exposed to evidence, witness testimonies. They'll often have the opportunity to interrogate sort of experts and ask questions about the topics at hand. And then the second phase of a transnational or of a citizens assembly is a dialogue or a deliberative process where members will sit often in small groups and discuss together. They'll weigh arguments, they'll extend their knowledge about the topic together. And then finally, there's a decision-making component where the members of the assembly will often surface proposals or develop recommendations together. Third characteristic of a citizens' assembly is that facilitation is often provided independently of the convening and organizing bodies. And then finally, there's really an effort to make sure that this learning phase is kind of supported by what is considered to be a balanced set of information materials. Factual set of information materials, but balances different perspectives and worldviews about the issues. When we talk about transnationality, we're talking about people from 2+ nations participating. And then finally, we're sort of in the data that I provided above, we're kind of bringing together a bunch of different definitions, but I'm going to go in and talk to you more about the Global Citizens Assembly that we organized in a moment. So there's an increasing recognition because of everything that Caroline mentioned earlier that transnational issues require transnational democratic solutions. So in the recent IPCC report, for example, they highlighted for the very first time that inclusive governance leads to more effective and sustainable adaptation outcomes. They also recognize that sort of multi-stakeholder co-learning platforms, transboundary collaborations, community-based adaptation and participation scenarios, et cetera, are like key to adaptation to the climate and ecological crisis. And I wanted to highlight that because it's really important to recognize that even scientists that are concerned with the ecological crisis are recognizing that multi-stakeholder approaches are critical to addressing the climate crisis. So the Global Assembly itself, our mission was to give everyone a seat at the global governance table. Going back to this point of our ancestors 11,000 years ago, how do we reimagine what social technologies we use as humanity to be able to address planetary crises that affect all of us? And so what we wanted to do is bring together a snapshot of humanity as individuals into a global decision-making body. And what we did was we organized a 4-step process. I mentioned earlier that citizens' assemblies often have a sort of sortition selection, which is what political scientists call like a lottery selection process for identifying the members of the assembly. In order to do that at a global level, of course, we don't have a global database of humans. We don't have a global database of Social Security, a voter registry. There's no sort of consistent way in which our sort of national identity is indicated. And of course, there are many people who don't necessarily belong to a particular nation state as a result of war, dislocation, et cetera. And so what we wanted to do was provide an opportunity for anyone, any human, to have an equal opportunity of being selected. And so we started out with a random selection of geographies. So we took a NASA database that maps population density on a 2D model of planet Earth. And then what we did was we randomly selected individual humans out of that database of 7.8 billion people. And then we identified which administrative region in the world they came from. And then we offset a random point in that location. So essentially what this process did was ensure that we picked random geographic locations that were weighted based on population distribution across Earth. And so in the process of this, we also built some algorithms to ensure that no modern nation state was overrepresented. So for example, the United States has about 4.5% of global population. So we ensured that the algorithm of selection would pick no more than 5 geographic locations within the United States. So we rounded up to the nearest integer. We were working with 100 people. And so we wanted to make sure that no nation state was overly represented. Similarly, some of the larger nation states in the world, you see China and India here with about 17 points, respectively, have about 34% of the global population. So that's a sort of a good distribution. You also see that smaller geographic locations were also represented in this selection. So you have this small point here in the Gulf of Aden is actually an island called Socotra, which is one of the most sort of geologically speaking, rather, isolated landforms on planet Earth. And so we conducted a geographic distribution first. Then we went and organized and worked with local community organizations, deliberative democracy organizations all around the world. And we identified what we call cluster facilitators. So these are groups that were supporting regions or languages to be able to coordinate these different distribution of points. So we had several groups that were based on language. So a sort of English speaking Anglophone group, Portuguese speaking, Spanish, French, Arabic. We also had clusters in China and India specifically because of the number of points, because of their idiosyncrasies. And then we also had a group of kind of 30 odd additional points that didn't fit well into any particular linguistic community or sort of geographic community that wasn't sort of relying on imperial or colonial histories. So we took basically 3 groups of clusters, points, and we allocated them based on longitudinal sort of areas of the world. So longitude 0 to 40 east, for example, was cluster 1. Longitude 40 to 90 east was cluster 2. Longitude 90 plus. The idea of bringing together people in a way that didn't sort of reinforce colonial imperial histories, but to be able to support a co-location of local actors within each of these regions. These cluster facilitators then organized a community of practice in each of their regions that then went around and identified essentially a local community organization in each of these 100 locations. And then these community organizations were trained to do on-street recruitment. They were literally walking around asking people on the street, would you like to participate in a Global Citizens Assembly? They were knocking on people's doors, asking if they would like to join a Global Citizens Assembly. We were offering members of the assembly a stipend of about US $600. And it's important to note that this $600 stipend was actually offered everyone in the world, nominally the same amount, irrespective of where people came from. We wanted to value people's time nominally, not based on sort of an index of living standards, for example, but to nominally value everyone's time in this assembly as equivalent members the same. So people on the street that were approached were offered $600 US to participate in a Global Citizens Assembly that would be taking place for COP26. We ended up recruiting about 700 potential participants. So this was the first step of the two-step random selection I mentioned before. The second step was then to organize a sort of algorithm that would match the 100 people selected with the demographic characteristics of humanity according to 4 additional demographic characteristics. So gender, age, years in education, which is a proxy for socioeconomic status. They're concerned about the climate crisis. Because they were deliberating about the climate crisis, we wanted to make sure they weren't considered biased. We had a data from a UNDP data set of about 1.5 million people from 50 countries, which said that 64% of humanity believed that the climate was in an emergency. We might anticipate that those numbers are higher based on recent sort of environmental issues and increasing recognition that they're caused by climatic changes. But that was the case in around 2020 when the survey was done and when we were starting this process. And then, of course, we embedded a geographic distribution into the process through the geographic distribution in the initial step. So we made sure that we had one person from each of the 100 randomly selected locations and that they matched the demographic characteristics of humanity. And I think this is important to just pause and share this with you for a moment, that the column on the left is the demographic characteristics of humanity in these regards. The column in the middle are the respondents. And this is what you often see when you look at, like, for example, a direct democracy process or an open for all activity where the most interested people will show up. The reality is that the most interested people are often the people that are more concerned than average about a particular issue. But importantly, they're also far more educated than the average. And of course, education is highly correlated with wealth. And so you often end up having the most educated, the most wealthy, the most connected members of a community, as well as the people that are most concerned about an issue that show up for an open for all event. And so by controlling for this demographic characteristics, the final set of assembly members on the right actually matches more the demographic characteristics of humanity. So we were able to make sure that the number of assembly members, for example, that were concerned about the climate crisis that they were deliberating about matched that of humanity. We were able to moderate somewhat the overrepresentation of people in higher education, for instance, et cetera. It's important to note that the assembly members came from 49 different countries. They spoke 42 different languages. More than a third had never been on a video call before. So what we're doing now, they'd never done before. They'd never even been on a smartphone speaking to somebody on the other side of a screen. More than 11 of the assembly members were fully illiterate. And so what you're looking at is essentially demographic characteristics that much closer represent the average of humanity. And so what we did was we supported each of those assembly members to learn about the climate crisis. We created an information booklet with a knowledge and wisdom committee that was composed of scientists. For example, it was chaired by Sir Bob Watson, who's chaired both the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as well as the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And so it was chaired by this scientist. We also had indigenous wisdom keepers joining this. We had petroleum scientists joining this, and really a mixture of perspectives from around the world to be able to co-create an information booklet for people about the climate crisis. We then supported this information booklet to be contextualized and localized. So we organized with each of the community organizations local community contextualization events where the information booklet was translated, but also localized. So bringing in local examples, et cetera. Then we supported each assembly member through the community host to provide internet connection, a device, to provide someone who could support the use of the device for people who aren't used to using computers and aren't used to being on video calls. And then importantly, every single member of the assembly had a translator companion who was able to translate the conversations so that it was understandable. And this is a picture of one of the assembly members, Cham Chayabat, in Thailand, being supported by a translator as well as a device and the kind of setup that he was able to have access to in Thailand. And I also just want to acknowledge and celebrate the work that Caroline did, actually organizing the community in Germany, and actually not only randomly selecting a participant from Germany to participate in the Global Assembly based on the randomly selected point that landed nearby, but also providing facilitation and translation support for the assembly member from Germany. So some other things that we did to be able to make this more inclusive, we developed hand signals. People were like communicating through translators. So we developed a set of hand signals that we checked to see if they were sort of kind of culturally appropriate for people all around the world. We realized, for example, that holding up your hand is considered rude in quite a few cultures. So we created a new hand signal where you put one hand inside of the other to indicate that you have something in your hand. And we tried to develop these hand signals in such a way that they actually reinforced good deliberative practice. Because, of course, the bulk of the Citizens' Assembly was intended to provide an opportunity for these citizens from all around the world to discuss the climate crisis together. We wanted this to be a respectful conversation, to elevate the unforced force of the better argument, as Jürgen Habermas would say, or to contribute to the collective consciousness, as the physicist David Bohm would say. And so we put this hand signal, for instance, if I have something to offer, as the sort of indicator that an assembly member wanted to share something. And the idea is that this wanting to say something was actually framed as wanting to contribute to the dialogue, wanting to offer an alternative perspective, and recognizing that the contribution to the group discourse was actually in service of the group's collective consciousness. In addition to that, I'll just highlight really quickly the co-creation approach, because of course, how do people from 49 countries coming together on a Zoom call with their translators actually develop something together? We created a multi-step co-creation process where essentially the members were working in 20 breakout groups of 5. They surfaced ideas in these 20 breakout groups. And then we had a group of independent editors, an emphasis here on independent editors, because we didn't want, as the organizers or the facilitation team, which was also being organized as independently as possible, to have influence over the outcome. And so we had a group of independent editors take those inputs from the 20 breakout groups, edit those inputs into a single document. Then they brought that document back to the assembly members, and we surfaced another 20 rounds of comments. We then converged this into another final document, a third round of convergence and review and comments. And then at that point, after 3 rounds of sort of collective development across breakout groups with the support of independent editors, the proposals were then sent to a vote. In this vote, assembly members were actually voting item by item on the elements of on the proposals that they created, to ensure that there weren't any sort of, in a way, free riders is what you would call it in the sort of electoral representative legislature, where a legislator sort of throws in something into a bigger bill to kind of get passed because people agree with 90%. We wanted people to really like respond to and to sort of assert their comments and views on each of the different elements of the what they created, which they chose to call the People's Declaration for the Sustainable Future of Planet Earth, which is a name that they came up with themselves. This People's Declaration for the Sustainable Future of Planet Earth was presented at COP26 in Glasgow in November 2021, on stage actually with the First Minister of Scotland, who was hosting, as well as the climate activist Vanessa Nakate and others, and has since been used as an advocacy document by members of the global community. All right, so that is an overview of a very complex process in a very short amount of time. I hope that that provides you all with a good introduction overview of what citizens' assemblies can be in practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. There was so much work put into that project, and honestly, the outcomes are amazing, and the reach that you guys were able to, the amount of people you were able to reach is amazing. I just want to jump right into the questions right now. I would like to open this up that you can unmute yourself if you'd like. Well, we will unmute you from our side if you have a question. Maybe if we could start with the question that's in the chat. Dario, if you would like to say it out yourself, and this question is directed to Daniela. If we could just, but if you don't feel comfortable speaking, please just leave your questions in the chat and I will read them out, and maybe just say which speaker you're directing your questions to. Okay, maybe I just read out the first question for now, and it's for you, Daniela. Are there any proposals for a real direct democracy tool at European Union level?
Yeah, I answered. Maybe some people can't see the chat, but there are some proposals, of course. I mean, there is good and wide support across democracy, civil society organizations for advancing the European Citizens Initiative, really evolving it to become a real right of also initiative for citizens that could trigger EU-wide referendum. And there's also proposals then from political actors, like there's different reports in the European Parliament committees and the AFCO, the Constitutional Affairs Committee, that also support this. And then proposals from the big conference on the future of Europe, which was our smaller version of the Global Assembly, was also using citizens' assemblies and random selection and sortition at EU level for the very first time in history. And from there, a proposal also came out that would strengthen the ECI and also introduce EU-wide referendum. The question just always comes down to who would trigger the EU-wide referendum. So, of course, in the proposals of the Conference on the Future of Europe, it says that it should be triggered by the European Parliament in rare cases. Of course, our vision of that and view of that is different. We want citizens to be able to trigger that. We want that to be bottom up.
Yeah, thanks, Daniela. Please, can you use the raise hand function if you'd like to ask a question, and we'll just go through the questions that the floor has. Are there any questions? No?
Wow, I didn't think we would be able to explain everything.
Yeah, me neither.
Maybe we can give Dario an opportunity since he was interested in asking a question.
Yeah.
Did you have something to say?
You are unmuted, Dario.
No, not Dario, Didier.
Oh, DDA.
Yes, it's okay that I speak now?
Yes, please.
Okay, it is really very interesting about the last project. So I didn't know about this. Once again, great. Who was paying for this? How was it? Maybe you said it at the beginning and I missed it, but yeah, I suppose it was very expensive. So who was paying for this? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for.
For you.
Thank you, Landeka. Thank you, Didier, for the question. So yes, the overall cost of the Global Citizens Assembly was about US $1 million. And so just to say that it would have cost much more, and the project really did rely on global solidarity. A lot of organizations contributed an exceptional amount of work over and beyond what any sort of financial compensation would have been able to cover. And there were about 400 individuals and organizations in more than 100 countries that contributed to making the Global Assembly happen. The $1 million was a mix. There was an initial sort of crowdfunding campaign that did bring in some smaller resources to be able to get started. But in addition to that, we received £100,000 from the Scottish government. And then the rest of the funding was received from primarily philanthropic organizations, foundations in the global north. So groups like the Climate Emergency Collaboration Group, which is a consortium of many funders like Ford Foundation, Oak, SIF, etc. There's some funding was received from the European Climate Foundation and other philanthropic organizations, if that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. We also have another question from Itzel from the chat. Itzel, I'll read this one out because I take it you don't really want to. Okay, I see you, Sam. Itzel says, how many people were involved in the core organization of the Global Citizens Assembly? So this one is for you again, John. You're very famous.
Thank you, Itzel, for the question. And yeah, I mean, I also it's the curse of the panel discussion. I think the last person has the most memorable presentation. Since you've all sat through about an hour of discussion first. So, but I'll answer all the questions that come happily. And also, maybe I'll just also add, this speaks a bit to Didier's question about the funding and transparency. one of our values of the Global Citizens Assembly was openness, because we wanted people to be able to learn from the exercise. Really the main objective, beyond giving everyone a voice at the global governance table, particularly around climate, was sort of offering an opportunity to learn and kind of experiment and explore and innovate in a sort of framework of solidarity globally, what global governance and planetary governance could look like, for example, if we were to reimagine it completely. And we published more than 850 pages on our website. So if you go to globalassembly.org, we have an executive summary, a short summary of what we did. We have a more than 300-page reports. We also have published everything from contracts to facilitation plans. So you can literally see absolutely everything, and there's full transparency on the funding and everything else for the project. In terms of who was involved in the core organization, we also have a full roster of all of the different teams. We use something that is often called, well, we modified something often called holacracy or sociocracy. It's essentially a form of decentralized autonomous organization. It's often used by social movements in the last years, like Extinction Rebellion, for example. And the idea is to create a series of groups that are able to focus on a particular topic. They have a mandate to work on, for example, communications or fundraising, and they have autonomy within that circle to be able to take decisions, and they communicate to each other through anchor circle meetings and through other linkages and liaisons. And so we were able to use that approach to really radically decentralize the organization of the Global Assembly, of course, within the constraints of organizing such a complex project on a short time horizon. And this is how we were able to bring on more than 400 organizations and people in over 100 countries to be a part of building this. And just to say that in terms of the core anchor circle, our organization, Innovation for Policy Foundation, coordinated the anchor circle, designed the organizational structure and the Global Assembly. And we were joined by two other organizations, one that is now called ISWI, which is a British organization, and another organization called Deliberativa. And our organization, I for Policy, is sort of Pan-African organization. I was joined by two colleagues. So there are about 10 people in that anchor circle that then filtered out into the other sections, teams of the Global Assembly to coordinate the overall action.
Yeah, please can we let Siri unmute Siri for his question?
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the great presentation for all the speaker. I have a question regarding to the what is launch petitions transnational, because right now I'm landing a petition to stop human rights abuse and restore democracy and make peace in Cambodia. So could you please tell me who can I contact or send this petition to be effective to take the action in EU? And I would like to get some help more like to do this petition, like to get more support. So who can I ask for help? Yeah, thank you.
Daniela, maybe you can answer this one for us.
Yeah, we need, of course, political support and government support where we can. So if we can get support of UN member states, that's of course ideal. So I can also put a link in the chat. Any NGOs you're also working with or connected with, we're also collecting, of course, CSO support. But we also had like letters of invitations you could send to your Ministry of Foreign Affairs so they could also support such an idea. So I can put the link to the campaign in the chat.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your question. I'm going to go to the chat now. We have a question from Sebastian, and it's for all the speakers, but maybe Caroline, you can take this one. For all the speakers, what are the main challenges for citizen participation in deliberative processes?
Yeah, that they don't exist, or that they don't exist everywhere where they should exist. And of course, I mean, I think when we speak about deliberative processes and participation and direct democracy, we always say the first precondition is having a democratic system to begin with, right? So the backsliding of democracy around the world, and like for the first time since the fall of the Soviet Union, basically since the collapse of the Soviet Union, we're actually seeing the number of democracies lowering again. So we've had 30 years where each year we'd have new democracies and people introducing more new democratic systems, and they weren't always perfect, but for the first time in like 30 years, we're seeing that we're having less and less democracies around the world. So without that to begin with, there is just no possibility for participation or deliberation, right? Because you need free press, you need to be able to exercise your freedom of speech without fear of retribution. You need to have access to good courts. You need to have good representation to begin with. So if you don't have those things, like, we can forget about participation. And then the second thing I would say is like, then often what we see is when new tools are introduced like this, with the first, like, sort of, we throw out the child with the bathwater, like we throw out the first pancake and the whole thing goes, right? Like, it's, people also need time to learn how new tools work. So you can't expect people to have a citizens assembly be introduced, or to have a citizens initiative, right, to be introduced, and for that all of the population immediately knows exactly how this tool will serve them and how they will be able to use it. So you also need time to learn democracy and to make mistakes in that sense. But in the end, it's also what John said, right? Like, inclusive governance is more sustainable, meaning that, like, if people are able to make their own decisions for themselves, they're also more likely to support them and to help implement them. And in the end, it's all about making people responsible for their, like, or accountable and responsible and able to shape their own futures.
Yeah, we're running out of time a little bit, but we'll take this one for Daniela. So it's, do you know if the EU is planning any campaign to raise awareness of the ECI? It seems to be a good tool, not so risky for the EU governments, as it is not binding, and yet not so many citizens know about it.
Yeah, there's already, it's been in the works. So it's already been a years-long campaign, but of course it moves slow. It's called the EU Take the Initiative. So, like, you take the initiative. Nice play on words the EU always has. And there's a different, variety of, like, communication materials that's there. I can also link it here in the chat. There's an ECI ambassador program. I'm an ECI ambassador, so we're basically like multipliers for the ECI, and we go to different events, especially at local levels, like different festivals, to speak about the ECI. And there's a whole calendar of also, we're trying to really reach people on the ground. So there is already a communications campaign in the works, but I think this could be done a lot better. For example, in connecting it with already existing, like, Europe Day, or connecting ECIs with citizens assemblies, the citizens panels we have at the EU, really popular and tool right now that deliberative democracy organizations are pushing for. So I think connecting ECIs and really building this democratic ecosystem, I think that's really going to be the key if we're going to push the awareness. And in the end, as I always say, we cannot just throw the money at the issue with the low public awareness. All the funding in the world is not going to just help raise awareness for the ECI. In the end, the tool needs to sell itself. So we need strong political responses to ECIs, because that's what's going to get really the interest of then the media, and then interest of people.
Yeah, thank you. And can we please just unmute Didier as a final question? I see you have a couple of questions that have been coming in. Maybe if you would speak and we can just hear which question exactly you'd like to be answered.
Yes, thank you. Actually, first, I have only one question, but it's maybe outside of the scope. Well, it's certainly a bit of outside of the scope, but still. Do you know about the initiative concerning a project of Parliament of the United Nations, and what do you think about this project? I know it is not about direct democracy, but it is about global democracy. And yeah, and maybe I have one more last question that I didn't write, but are you also thinking about kind of world referendum, but in an electronic way, or not at all? But I will take a look at your websites after. Anyway, very interesting. Thank you.
Sure, Caroline, I definitely think this one is for you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so we are aware of the campaign for UN Parliamentary Assembly, and we actually work together with it. So the World Citizens Initiative, which Daniela proposed, and the UN Parliamentary Assembly are both part of a campaign that Democracy International is running together with a group of over, it's late, together with a group of over 200 civil society organizations around the world, which includes Greenpeace and Avaz. So we are calling for a more democratic UN, and one of the things that we are calling for is a parliamentary assembly. And just for the people watching or in this meeting who don't really know what the difference would be between that and the General Assembly, which exists, right? So the UN right now has a General Assembly, which, as I mentioned, is made up of representatives of member states. So these are political appointees, high-level diplomats who are not directly elected, and only in the best case appointed by a democratically elected government, but in many cases not. There is no democratically elected government to appoint them. And so the idea of a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly is basically, as in any parliamentary elections, that people would be able to vote for somebody in their country who would represent them at the UN. Like it happens, for example, in the European Union. And so that's a very nice and simple and doable idea. And that's definitely worth looking into. And I think the link is also in the chat. And it's also something that we work towards. The world referendum thing, I can quickly deal with that. So, like, yes, ideally, of course, for something global, we should be able to decide globally. The problem is that we don't have implementation infrastructure on the global level. So, like, who would be the government that this referendum would be sent to? Who would implement these decisions? So even the UN, like, the best that you can hope for is a resolution, right, which is basically an agreement between member states. So I'm not aware of any campaigns that are working towards that. I'm also not sure it's at the moment something that is possible or even desirable.
Yeah, thank you, Caroline. So that ends off our question session. We're also just running a bit out of time. But I think in closing that we recognize that while direct democracy holds a promise and a means of empowering citizens and fostering inclusivity and implementing, and this is able to be implemented on a transnational scale, it presents like a whole lot of unique hurdles. The complexity of diverse cultures, legal frameworks, and just the sheer magnitude of the issues that we face, like on a global level, like from country to country. And while there may not be a one-size-fits-all solution, our conversation, I feel, has revealed some inspiring examples of transnational initiatives that have shown like good signs and things that we can work towards. And the models offer lessons and they demonstrate potential. Which I think is what is important. And I think for our three panelists, thank you so much for being here. But I think just in closing, maybe just 30 seconds from each of you guys, what do you think the future of transnational democratic processes looks like? Okay, we'll start with Daniela because you're the first one on my screen.
Okay, well, what I think about what I hope it looks like, I hope there's more political will. Maybe this is also a quick response to the question on the challenges, but I think all of the lobbying efforts that we did for the European Citizens Initiative, even if it had great civil society support, I think it would have been in vain if there wasn't political will on the other end. So we do need to find the allies on the political side as well. So that's what I hope. And I think as also politicians are waking up, realizing they have to take decisions closer to the citizens, I think we're going to get in that direction too. Caroline?
Yeah, I think it has to look more participatory and more direct and more democratic and more inclusive. If we look at our transnational organizations that we have right now, they were built for a different time. They were built in a different era where it wasn't possible for people to decide directly. A lot of people, not everybody, I'm willing to admit, but more people than ever have access to the internet, have smartphones, have possibilities to vote for, like to share their opinions on things instantly. So there's really no reason to have these filter upon a filter upon a filter upon a filter for people at the global level. So I think we're at a natural sort of evolution point where we have to make a decision to move forward and to build something better. And just as a sort of closing thing on that, the UN is currently in a reform process. So at the end of next year in September, during the General Assembly week, there will be the Summit of the Future, where they will discuss many different things, but they will also discuss how to upgrade the UN. So we're living through a historic moment right now.
Yeah, definitely. And last but not least, over to you, John.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I just want to build on what Caroline said. You know, it's been more than 75 years since the UN was founded. And we have this historic opportunity coming up. So I think it's really important for everyone on this call, if you're not a member of the We the People's campaign, then join it. Start reimagining what new democratic futures look like for humanity. I shared this chart earlier, right? This bar chart that was like going up about democratic innovations. And you saw like a couple of spattering of transnational democratic innovations in there. I think we're about to experience really a renaissance and like a kind of explosion of innovation in the transnational space. Following the Global Citizens Assembly, there was a group that had attempted to organize a global assembly on genome editing a few years ago. But in the next years, we can imagine a global citizens assembly on things like artificial intelligence, on oceans. Those are two proposals that are currently existing from very strong organizations and consortiums of partners. But what I really hope is that we just continue having more innovation in this space. That we don't know what the answers are. There's a really strong kind of urge for citizens assemblies, of course, for random selection, for equitable participation, but there's also an opportunity for other forms of democratic participation, you know, World Citizens Initiative, where you're surfacing proposals from humanity to be discussed and debated, perhaps by a global citizens assembly or by a parliament, and the kind of integration and communication between these. And I don't want to sound sort of antagonistic to the modern nation state, but I do think it's important to recognize that our current governance architecture is to blame for all of our global challenges, whether that's wars that we see, whether that's sort of inability to deal with pandemics in an effective way, whether that's an inability to deal with more than 3 decades of scientific information and evidence that we're running off of a cliff with our environment. Our governance institutions are just not fit for purpose anymore. We live in a global world. We can communicate globally. We can move globally, we trade goods globally. What happens in one side of the world affects people on the other in ways that we're all intimately aware now as a result of the pandemic. And so I think the question isn't, you know, whether this should happen. I think it must, if we're going to have a better sort of future for humanity. And so I really encourage everyone on this call again to join the We the People's movement. And I say that as someone who will join as Innovation for Policy Foundation. We're obviously partnered and collaborating with Democracy International and people, but we haven't formally joined yet. And I'm going to take my own advice, practicing what I preach to you all, and join. But I really encourage you all to join that movement, to form your own initiatives, to join other initiatives and really push for a more positive democratic future, because it really will take we the people in order to build a we the people based global planetary governance. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, John. I really think that there's no better time than now for like democratic reform on the transnational level. And this is definitely our chance. And I think we should all grab it with both hands and make the most of it. I would like to extend a huge thank you to our panelists for their expertise and their thought-provoking contributions, as well as to the participants for their engagements and their valuable perspectives. Together, we can strive for inclusion, transparent, and effective decision-making processes that truly reflect the voices and the aspirations of all citizens across all borders. This is the end of this webinar, and we have our last webinar in this series coming up in 2 weeks, so please join that. The topic is why direct democracy doesn't work. Come to find out more. This will be in 2 weeks, and thank you so much for everybody for joining. Again, to our panelists, John, Daniela, Caroline, thank you, and thank you to all the participants. Goodbye.